They say a man doesn't disappear all at once. It happens slowly, silently, like the tide, pulling back from the shore, a little more each day, until one morning he looks in the mirror and sees a stranger staring back. I never thought it would happen to me. For 72 years, I was a man who knew himself, a Navy veteran, steady, disciplined, unshaken by life's tides. When my wife passed, the silence in the house was deafening, but I filled it with things I could count on. Black coffee at the same corner diner, Sunday poker with the boys, and those worn-in flannel shirts, the ones that felt like old friends draped over my shoulders. It was a simple life. Predictable, maybe, but it was mine. And then Margaret walked in. She wasn't just a woman, she was a force of nature, the kind of person who made a room brighter just by stepping into it. At 67, she carried herself with the kind of confidence that only comes from never once doubting your place in the world. She laughed loudly, spoke with her hands, and somehow she made the simplest things, ordering dinner, choosing attire, feel like an adventure. And from the moment we met, something in me began to shift. At first, it was intoxicating. She made me feel like I wasn't just getting older, I was starting over. Suddenly, my world was filled with new experiences, new places, new versions of myself I'd never even imagined. Candlelit restaurants instead of my usual diner, polished dress shoes in place of my old boots, lively, bustling nights instead of quiet evenings on the porch. And every time I hesitated, she'd smile, touch my arm, and say, "Henry, it's about time you lived a little." So, I did. I let her guide me toward a version of myself that laughed more, dressed sharper, walked with a little more energy. I let her opinions shape my choices. Let her laughter drown out the quiet voice in the back of my mind that whispered, "Is this really me?" And then, one night, I caught my own reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me, he was someone Margaret would admire, polished, refined, charming. But he wasn't the man I had spent 72 years becoming. My flannel shirts, buried somewhere in the back of the closet. My morning coffee, replaced by espresso I didn't even like. The stories I used to tell about my late wife, my time in the Navy, met with polite nods before the conversation drifted elsewhere. That was the moment it hit me. I hadn't just fallen in love. I had disappeared into it. And the real question wasn't whether Margaret loved me, but whether, in the process of loving her, I had stopped loving myself. What I learned through this journey changed me forever. And maybe, just maybe, it will change you too. This is Elderly Wisdom Story, where we don't just tell stories, we uncover truths. If you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered where you've gone now, if this story stirred something inside you, subscribe. Not for me, for the version of you that still wants to rise. Because that version, he's still here, and maybe it's time to start listening again. They say love changes you, but no one ever warns you how easily, how silently you can start slipping away from yourself. It doesn't happen in a crash. It happens like a river wearing down stone, gentle, constant, until one day you wake up and no longer recognize the man in the mirror. First, I welcomed it. After all, isn't change good? Isn't love supposed to lift you, make you better, pull you from your ruts and into possibility? Margaret certainly thought so. She'd tilt her head at me, a half smile tugging at her lips, straighten my collar, and brush imaginary dust from my sleeve, as if rewriting me was a form of affection. "Henry," she'd say, her voice warm as silk, "you've been stuck in the past too long. Let me bring you back to life." And how could I say no to that? So I let her. It started small. A new restaurant here, a different cologne there, a crisp leather jacket in place of my well-worn flannel. The first time I put it on, she stepped back with her hands on her hips, eyes gleaming with approval. "Now that," she murmured, "is a man who looks like he belongs in my world." Her world, vibrant, social, polished, full of dinner parties I never quite felt part of, places I'd never been, with people who spoke like they were always auditioning for something. And caught in the warmth of her gaze, I wanted to belong. So I told myself it was nothing, just a few adjustments. A new shirt, a different haircut, an espresso instead of my usual black coffee. Every time I made a change, she'd smile, kiss my cheek, tell me how proud she was. And I believed it was love. I thought it meant we were growing together, that I was learning to bend without breaking. But bending became reshaping, and reshaping became erasing. One evening at dinner, she ordered for me without asking. "Try eating lighter," she said with a nudge. "We don't want to gain weight, right?" She laughed, but something in her words stuck, landed heavy in my chest. Later, she asked me to skip poker night, just this once, she promised. And instead, we went to a wine tasting. where I stood among strangers, swirling glasses, and talking about things I couldn't care less about. "You'll love it," she whispered at my ear, and because she wanted me to love it, I convinced myself I did. I kept telling myself, compromise, that's what love is. But that quiet voice inside me, the one I'd been silencing, started getting louder. And one evening, as I stood brushing my teeth, I looked up and really saw myself, not in the mirror, not just physically, but in the questions. Who am I dressing for? Who am I pretending to be? That reflection staring back at me. He looked like someone Margaret would admire, but he didn't look like the man who had buried his wife with dignity, or served his country with pride, or told Navy stories over black coffee and old jokes with old friends. That man was buried beneath the version of me she had sculpted. And for the first time, the real question wasn't, does she love me? It was, do I still love the man I'd become? And if I didn't, what did that mean? The first time I truly noticed the shift, it wasn't in the mirror, it was in the way others looked at me. Tom, my oldest friend, the kind who calls it like it is, sat across from me at our usual booth in the corner coffee shop, the one we'd been coming to for years, until Margaret came along. Now the place felt foreign, like slipping into an old pair of boots that no longer quite fit. He stirred his coffee slowly, studying me over the rim of his mug. Not rudely, just thoughtfully. "You don't laugh like you used to, Henry," he said, soft, matter of fact, but it landed like a stone in my chest. I tried to brush it off, to make a joke, but nothing came, and that silence told me everything, because I couldn't remember the last time I had really laughed, the kind of laugh that shook your ribs and wrinkled your eyes, the kind that made you feel wide open and alive. That moment stuck with me. And then, a few days later, my granddaughter burst through the door, full of energy and sunlight. "Grandpa," she shouted, "where's your cowboy hat?" That hat? It had been with me through more than most people knew. Covered in dust from long-forgotten roads, shaped by stories it could never tell out loud. But now, I didn't even know where it was. That night, I found it buried deep in the back of the closet. Untouched, unneeded. I ran my fingers along the worn leather brim. And I swear, it felt like holding a version of myself I had quietly packed away. And the truth hit me. Margaret never told me to get rid of it, just like she never told me to stop drinking black coffee, or wearing my flannels, or showing up for poker night. But somehow, without force, without argument, I had let them all go, one by one. It wasn't until the charity gala that the truth fully surfaced. I was standing in a room full of strangers, wearing a suit Margaret had chosen. The conversation swirled around me, polished, elegant, exhausting. I adjusted my posture out of habit, only to feel her hand on my back. "Stand up straighter," she whispered. "You don't want to look weak." That word, weak, cut deeper than I expected. I had been called many things in my life: a sailor, a husband, a father, a man who could hold his own in any room, but never weak. And yet, in that moment, surrounded by people I didn't know, wearing clothes that didn't feel like mine, telling stories no one seemed to care about, I felt smaller than I'd ever felt in my life. When I tried to share a Navy story, one I loved, one that always got a smile or a nod, Margaret lightly touched my arm, smiled, and said, "Oh, darling, they don't want to hear about that." Just like that, it was gone. The story, the moment, the version of me that had lived it, reduced to background noise. And for the first time I wondered, when did my life become something to edit? When did the parts that shaped me, my past, my voice, my joy, become something to politely skip over? That night, I stood in front of the mirror. And it wasn't just about the reflection staring back at me. It was about everything I could no longer see. The laugh lines from poker nights softened, the smell of leather and fresh coffee replaced by cologne that never felt like mine, the flannel, the boots, the stories, all packed away like that old cowboy hat. And in that silence, I finally saw it clearly. Real love should never require you to disappear. Someone who truly loves you will never ask you to erase yourself to fit their world. But perhaps the hardest truth? I never asked her to love all of me. I never required it. And somewhere along the way, I stopped requiring it of myself. The reflection from the night before, it hadn't left my mind, even as I went through the motions, pouring coffee, standing on the porch while the morning sun crawled over the horizon. That image of myself, stiff and unfamiliar in that polished suit, lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the clothes. It wasn't just the way Margaret had smoothed over my past, as if it were an inconvenience. It was the weight of a deeper truth, that for months, I had been living a life that no longer felt like mine. And now, in the stillness of that morning, I stood wondering, who am I now? My hand hovered over the phone. For longer than I'd like to admit, I already knew how the conversation would go. Margaret would be charming at first, dismissive second, cold by the end. She always had a way of reshaping things that didn't fit her world, redefining them, or discarding them. And for far too long, I had let myself be reshaped. She picked up on the second ring. Her voice was light, effortless. "Henry, darling, I was just thinking about you." I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. "Margaret," I said, measured, calm. "I can't do this anymore." A pause, then a soft, airy laugh. "What are you talking about?" I hesitated, not because I wasn't sure, but because old habits, they die hard, and I'd spent months, maybe longer, trying to keep her happy. I said finally. "I've been trying to be someone I'm not, and I can't keep doing it." Silence. Longer this time. Then her voice softened, gentler, maybe even pitying. "Henry, you're just overthinking. Relationships are about compromise, you know that. You've changed for the better. I've helped you." "No," I interrupted, not unkindly. "You changed me for you, and I let you. That's on me." Her silence this time was different. Something lingered in the air between us. Regret? Frustration? It was hard to tell. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "So, that's it? You're throwing everything away?" And for just a second, I almost faltered. Not because I wanted to stay, but because it's hard to unlearn the instinct to make someone else comfortable at your own expense. Then my eyes drifted to the flannel shirt draped over the chair, the one Margaret once called messy, the one that felt like home. And suddenly, I knew. "No, Margaret," I said with the steadiness of someone who had finally come home. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm finally keeping something, myself." The silence that followed, it didn't need to be filled. The call ended without ceremony, and for the first time in a long while, I could breathe again. The next morning, I drove without thinking, letting muscle memory take the wheel. It wasn't until I saw the familiar neon glow of the poker lounge that I realized where I was going. A warmth spread through me, part nostalgia, part relief. And as I stepped inside, the scent of smoke and whiskey wrapped around me like an old friend. Tom looked up from the table, his surprise turning into that knowing grin. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, pushing out a chair. "Look who finally remembered where he belongs." I laughed, the real kind, deep in the chest, and slid into the seat, like I never left. The weight I'd been carrying for months began to lift, not all at once, but moment by moment, with the sound of shuffling cards and laughter that didn't feel borrowed. Later that night, I stood in front of my closet, not to wonder who I had become, but to reclaim what I had left behind. I reached down and pulled out my cowboy boots, the leather worn, but sturdy, still mine. As I slid them on, something inside me settled. Love, I realized, should never require you to vanish. It shouldn't ask you to trade your identity for someone else's comfort, because the most important love story, it's not the one you have with another person. It's the one you hold with yourself. And for the first time in a long while, I knew exactly who I was. The lesson I learned wasn't just about love. It was about identity, about self-respect, about the quiet but powerful difference between compromise and surrender. Because somewhere along the way, I mistook change for growth and sacrifice for love. But real love was never meant to make you smaller. It's not supposed to ask you to hide the parts of yourself that once made you feel whole. No, it should celebrate them. The hardest part about losing yourself? It isn't the moment you realize it's happened. It's the slow unraveling, the little compromises that seemed harmless at first, until one day you wake up and don't recognize the life you're living. It's easy to justify it. You tell yourself you're just adapting, just evolving, just being a good partner. But there's a fine line between growing with someone and disappearing in their shadow. And that line, it gets crossed the moment you begin silencing the very pieces of you that make you, you. I learned it the hard way, but in doing so, I discovered something more valuable than any candlelit dinner or borrowed identity. I rediscovered myself, because at the end of the day, when the crowd fades, when the noise settles, and you're standing alone in front of the mirror, you are all you have. And if you don't recognize the person staring back at you, then what was it all for? There's a kind of peace that only comes with reclaiming your own name, a kind of joy in walking through the world as yourself. No costume, no compromise, just you. The man who walks into the poker lounge again and feels like he never left. The man who pours his black coffee at the same booth, nods to the waitress, and smiles because that small act means something again. The man who slips on those old cowboy boots, feels the leather wrap around years of stories, and finally says, "I never had to change to be worthy." And maybe that's what we all deserve. To be seen, to be loved, to be known, without shrinking. So if you, like me, have ever started to fade, to vanish into someone else's expectations, this is your reminder. You are not too old to come back to yourself. You are not too late to begin again. You are not alone. And if this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause, remember, this is Elderly Wisdom Story, a place where we don't just share stories. We share truth, experience, wisdom from the life we've lived. After 60, 70, even 80 years on this earth, if you felt something in this, then maybe it's time to subscribe, not for information, but for connection, because your story still matters. Your voice still matters, and the journey isn't over yet. Let's keep walking together.